Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to some Rome 2 Total War. So, if you've been paying attention, there's been a pretty recent announcement that there's a new Total War game coming out. It's on the same engine as this one, and I suspect is going to have a lot of similarities, but it is Total War Attila. So, based on Attila the Hun and his exploits, it is heavily based around the fall of the Roman Empire, as well as the Hunnic hordes sort of going on, the start of the Dark Ages, you trying to either fend off the Dark Ages or you trying to start it, depending on which faction you are. The other one, of course, is the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantium Empire, which is much, much more intact at this period of time. Now, I'm not 100% sure what other factions are going to be in there. I'm guessing that there's going to be a lot of sort of like the Visigoths and stuff like that or whatever. And of course, you know, maybe Attila the Hun's faction is going to be playable, but he sounds more like he's going to be like those Timurid invasions that they had in Medieval 2, so you don't play him, he's an event that happens to you. Or it could be actually that he's part of the main campaign mode as well. It could really go either direction. Now, I think that this game is going to be a little bit like Napoleon Total War as compared to Empire Total War. It's going to probably play and run a lot like Rome 2 Total War. I'm hoping that they've decided to just take what they have, change the visuals a little bit, and keep most of the mechanics and the things like that relatively intact. And the reason I want this to happen is because Creative Assembly is a company that I like, but they've got their shortcomings. Every time they make a game, every single time they make a game, it starts off in an unplayable, buggy mess. And you know, I always get them at this stage because I don't really mind those sorts of things, but they do this pretty much every time. And what happens is they patch the game very diligently, and you end up eventually with a functional and really fun game. And that's pretty much how all their games work. The one exception is Empire never did stop being buggy, but I personally actually really liked Empire because it's, you know, a lot of fun. So what you end up with is these development cycles where they make a game, it's overambitious, they can't finish it on time, they rush it out. It's good on release in some ways, but it's got problems, it crashes, it's doing all that sort of stuff. And then they fix it, and then eventually they release a pseudo expansion or a standalone campaign set for this. They've been putting out a lot more standalone campaigns for Rome 2 Total War, and I actually have liked quite a few of them. They're a lot of fun, but if you eventually people sort of want a completely new game, and that's sort of what they've done here, I suspect. It could actually be a fully new game, and we'll end up with the same mess that we always see from these guys, but I'm expecting otherwise. I really am. So Attila Total War is going to be a lot of these sort of same melee units that you see here, but it's going to be a lot less sort of cohesive, well-disciplined troops, and it's going to be a lot of those sort of inexpensive rabble troops, and then a few sort of elite troops on a very much more rare scale. So it's going to go back to sort of that idea that Medieval had, where there were those very, very expensive top-tier troops, and they could just churn their way through really ridiculously large numbers of things that were supposedly medium-tier troops. So this game is very different. Most of my army here is the sort of medium-tier troops, and they've kind of wiggled it down to the point where elites are not quite as good as taking a large number of very average sort of legionary cohorts, as you can see. And unfortunately, the state of the game as it is just like people play Rome a lot, unless they're up against someone like a weaker faction, in which case they'll still take a very similar style here, just a lot of melee infantry. But anyway, yeah, so what I'm hoping for Attila is that it is just a Napoleonic-style advance in the game. I don't really want them to go through the whole thing again, just because I don't think that they would do a great job of it necessarily, and it's not really... It's not a setting that really excites me, the Dark Ages. It's when warfare was at its sort of most dull, where armies were at their most homogenous, and I mean, they just did not do as much that was interesting during that time period. It's why, you know, no one really talks about stuff that was happening during the Dark Ages. Everyone talks about what happened during Rome. Everyone talks about the medieval era, by which, you know, the later medieval era, of course, is what they sort of mean by that. But all of that sort of happened and is much more interesting than what is going on during the Dark Ages to me. So it's just a preference of setting. And of course, you know, there's still stuff going on in the Roman Empire as it's collapsing, causing it to collapse, of course. And of course, there's also a lot going on in the Eastern Roman Empire, which is still thriving at this period of time. But honestly, I'm just really not into, Attila the Hun as compared to people like Genghis Khan, for example, or even Tamerlane to a certain extent. I thought was more interesting as far as history goes, or the cults of personality that you've got in Rome, like Emperor Nero was an interesting fellow, or Caligula. Those are, of course, not really people you want to be like or anything like that, or rule your country like, because they didn't really do. But even the good, you even get the good emperors of Rome, like Hadrian or whatever, who did quite a lot for Rome. But despite all of that, I think that it's probably going to turn out to be a pretty good game. I'm hoping that they do a good job of it. I'm hoping that as well, though. I think part of the reason I'm not looking forward to it is because Creative Assembly did buy the rights to Warhammer. So they can actually make Total War Warhammer if they want to. And that's just something that I'm really hoping for. And if they're making one about Attila the Hun that I don't really care about, then that's them not making the Total War game that I do want. So it's just that sort of situation that we've got going here. So hopefully they'll still do a good job of this. But yeah, going back to their sort of development system, they did this with Shogun 2. They sort of made Fall of the Samurai. It was a completely different era, but it was the same sort of map. It was the same style of engine, I think. I'm pretty sure that they did both of those on the same engine. And a lot of the core mechanics remained very similar. I suspect they're going to do the same when they start doing their DLC for Attila. And I think that they've done this for pretty much every game since Empire, where they made Empire, it sort of got hammered out until it was okay or whatever, and then they released Napoleon Total War, and it was about 100 years later. A lot of the units were very different, but ultimately the core mechanics stayed very, very similar. So we're probably just seeing this cycle's iteration of that. Of course, there were like those extra campaigns that have come out so far, but none of those are really dramatic changes in the same way that Fall of the Samurai was. It was more like sort of like Rise of the Samurai, and that it was still a significant and substantial change in terms of unit and period and stuff like that, but it was not really a big deal in terms of mechanics or how that functioned. And even less so, just was not. I didn't really like Rise of the Samurai, honestly. It was a very dull period of history as far as armies go, and I think that's sort of another thing that I'm predicting happening for Attila. But hopefully I'll be proven wrong, or maybe they just will discard some of that history and instead will focus on making interesting units. And they've done that in the past. I mean, Creative Assembly is not a stickler for historicity. That's why you've got such bizarre things as like a snake launching artillery that people actually take on a frequent basis in this game if you happen to have that DLC, as compared to real life where it was just like, okay, well, it exists, we'll try it, and they sort of used it once and it didn't really do very well, so they never did it again. So yeah, hopefully that's what they will do. And I think there's also some interesting opportunities to make Attila to be something quite interesting and quite badass. He is, after all, one of history's sort of big nomadic conquerors, along with Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. But I do think that it's going to be something I'll have to keep an eye on. What I've seen so far, a lot of it seems very, very similar to Rome, but with it almost looks like the sort of thing you could have modded out of the Rome 2 engine, with similar sort of units. The way they function seems to be very similar. There's been some playthrough demos where there's a little bit more interactivity with things like barricades and stuff like that, which allows for some interesting options. I think that there's destructible barricades in the cities, for example. So if you happen to be trying to take Constantinople or whatever, the Byzantines can sort of put all sorts of jams in the into the environment around their cities to make it so that you have to be channeled through areas, or you get delayed in a certain area as you tear down the barricade with your melee troops, and then get shot quite severely with arrows and stuff like that. So all of that, I think, is something that could potentially happen. So hopefully that's something that we're going to be seeing there. It should be good. Alright. So one of the things I'd also like to talk about while I'm on this topic is this sort of state of the game of Rome 2 Total War. I've been playing a lot of it, and I've been getting my ass handed to me because I've just sort of been experimenting with all sorts of probably incredibly unviable strategies or what have you, but lately I've been trying out all the different factions, I've been trying out a variety of different unit compositions, and this is what I ended up sort of sticking with, is this sort of, like, Rome having lots and lots of their basic tier infantry, and honestly, it seems to work ridiculously too well. We're gonna see, like, our opponent took the same sort of army, the only difference was I took 3 units of archers and he took 2, so I was able to force him to walk towards me. He's got 1 more unit of swordsmen, but you'll see that I am going to slightly manage to outmaneuver that, partly because he's been forced to sort of walk in testudo into melee combat, losing his javelins, and he's losing troops to javelins as well, as you can see. Yeah. One of the other things, all units now are basically a missile troop. Each of these units has got the ability to just stand still and throw their javelins. Over here you can see my Romans just tearing through these auxiliaries, but combat is very slow. You're going to see these lines standing here staring at each other for a very, very long time. This is one of the biggest complaints I have about this update, especially in multiplayer, because we've got very similar numbers in our armies, and this really takes some of the decisive punch out of better infantry. So this is why you see so much mid-tier infantry right now. You can see that I've got a whole ton of these mid-tier infantry fighting this legionary cohort that's sort of pushing its way in, but at the same time, like, not much going on here. And this fight is going to just drag on far longer than it should. I mean, people say that they want the game to sort of allow you to establish these flank attacks with the cavalry and what have you. You could do that before. It was not a big deal to do that. But as you can see, like, because our forces are just both stretched lines of almost identical, we're not flanking each other, really, not realistically. I've got a little bit of a flanking force entangled with his flanking force over here, and he's got this auxiliary infantry over here that can sort of try to flank, but it's not really going to be enough. Of course, it doesn't help that he's got his legionary cohort sort of standing here in testudo, waiting to get in their turn of melee combat. So yeah, they're finally going to march into melee combat, but yeah, one of the other things is marching testudo is not the best formation for infantry combat. So yeah, the state of the game right now, I don't actually really like the changes that they've made to this game in terms of multiplayer and the way they've sort of gone about balancing and changing multiplayer. I think that far too often you find these factions where, because you can have such a long line that's difficult to flank of heavy infantry, of heavy and medium infantry that are not going to break, you just end up with these sort of very medium tier middle units. Before, it was possible that if you rely too heavily on this style of strategy, what I could do is, say, if I took 2 Praetorian Guard, or an Elephant or something like that, I could have punched a hole through his center, and it would have caused his lines to collapse over the rest of it. So even though I'd be stretched out thinner across the rest of my lines, I could put a decisive breakthrough at a certain point. What I've been finding in this particular case is that I just build these legionary cohorts because they can hold up a Praetorian Guard for a very, very long time. So there's not a big reason to go ahead and take those Praetorian Guard anymore. They don't do that decisive victory against your opponent anymore. Sure, they'll still win the combat, but it'll be a slow victory. It'll be a victory over a long period of time. And you're paying a premium to get a victory over a unit that is significantly cheaper. And the 2 units, like, of Legionary Cohort that you could get for 1 unit of Praetorian Guard, you're looking at a situation where you're almost invariably going to be receiving a better payoff from these 2 units of Legionary Cohorts than you would from the Praetorian Guard in any situation. Like, you can't build an entire battle line of Praetorian Guard. You need some Legionary Cohorts that can be stretched out and they can try and hold against the larger number of Legionary Cohorts while your Praetorian Guards do something decisive. That's not even possible anymore. Right now, all you have to do is hold out sort of in an area. My opponent had a very bad assault because he was assaulting up a hill. My units got to use all their pylon and his didn't, so I ended up winning this melee combat despite the fact that our forces are theoretically pretty much evenly matched. But I mean, there are a lot of factions that suffer from this style of play. The ones that don't have good grinding infantry that can just sort of do this very mechanized style Roman combat, which is to say, like, you get your units in combat, you just sort of let them grind it out over an extremely long period of time, and if you've got the better position, you'll eventually win with no real regard to flanking or tactics, because as much as like I'm still trying to use things like flanking here, that's not what really mattered. All that mattered was my position compared to my opponent, and the fact that he made the mistake of using Testudos. If he hadn't done that, I mean, he could have definitely overpowered me with his higher number of these legionary cohorts. He only has like 2 more than I do or something like that, but I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a mess right now. I did like it significantly better before the patch, because right now I feel like only a much smaller number of factions are viable right now than there were before, and that was pretty bad before as far as viability goes. And I mean, Rome just is probably the only one that I would ever want to play if I was in a tournament that let you freely pick your faction. Now, thankfully, most tournaments do say, like, you've got, like, ban picks and stuff like that, so a faction could get banned, but right now Rome is just too good at what they do, and I think that's sort of going to be a real problem. So, anyway, that is pretty much this game wrapped up. So, anyway, to sum up, I will keep an eye out for Attila. I'm hoping that they do some balance fixes to make Rome 2 a little bit more varied. I do think that it is just a little bit too much on the side of these sort of legionary cohorts. I think it's even in a worse state than when the game came out first, when it was just elite spam, because elite spam you could beat with various different types of armies. I don't feel like I can beat this sort of style of army without also using this style of army, and I think that that is a significant problem in the way the game currently is. Anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.